Sunday, November 10, 2024. I'm Anthony Davis. Welcome to the Weekend Show, where we make the time to consider the news of the week. You can support my work and independent journalism at patreon.com/5 Minute News. Our guest today is the founder and publisher of Courier Newsroom and CEO of Good Information, Inc., a civic incubator that invests in immediate solutions to counter disinformation online. Tara McGowan, welcome back to the Weekend Show.
Thanks, Anthony.
Tara, America, it seems, voted on Tuesday for autocracy over democracy, rejecting progress, opting for the loss of rights, buying into the disinformation campaign that Trump and Russia have been waging for almost a decade. I can admit that I failed to see this result coming. What about you?
I also failed to see this result coming. I think there's been a lot of reflection and introspection. I was always nervous. We always knew it would be close. No one thought that this was a shoo-in at any point, but I definitely have been reflecting the past few days over how we can be, and I don't want to be upset about this, but how we can be blinded by hope and faith in people. And yet I am also a big believer that oftentimes things and people have to hit a rock bottom when things are not working out in order to be able to rebuild. And I think that in many ways, we warded off this outcome in part by accident in 2020, and that it was inevitable in certain ways, because so many millions of Americans are truly fed up with our system of government and both parties not really doing anything about really the grave income inequality and other issues in this country. And so I have a lot to say, and we're going to get into all of it, I'm sure, about it. But I do believe that this is an important reckoning. I believe that obviously we are going to be up against an authoritarian leader and government of which we have not seen in this country before, and that there is going to be so many urgent needs to put in place protections and plans for the most vulnerable of us, which now doesn't just include communities of color or trans people, though they are certainly at risk. It includes all women in this country. And so that work will need to be done urgently. And yet there also needs to be work done, maybe by different people who are really focused on rebuilding from the ground up with a more honest, genuine, and progressive vision for this country that I think the Democratic Party has lacked for a number of years, and that lost them so many folks that did in fact vote against their own values in this election, in, I think, a vote of protest to a system that has lied to them and not supported them.
The tragedy, though, is that those who opted for Donald Trump in that protest have also voted against their own best interests too, because he has lied to them. He's lied that he can reduce the cost of living. He's lied that he can reduce grocery and gas prices. He's lied that he can even deport 15 million immigrants or close the border. I mean, these things are not easy. He was quoted a few days ago as saying that there is no price tag on this mass deportation, which could cost billions. And so I do think that within a few weeks of the Trump presidency, a lot of people who voted for him, either in protest or with full support, will have a great sense of buyer's remorse.
Yeah, I think this is part of the reckoning, unfortunately. And this is anecdotal, but I have heard it a lot. And I know a lot of my colleagues in this space have heard it a lot. A lot of people who cast their ballot for Donald Trump never believed that he would do some of the egregious things that he has said that he would do. When you have a spineless person who lies all the time, people don't believe a lot of it. That's part of the strategy, right? of fascists, and certainly of Donald Trump in particular, is that he says crazy things all the time. So people have sort of this cover of saying, yeah, but he didn't mean that. And they believe that. They believe that. And I also think that a lot of people who voted for him, and I'm not talking about the people who voted very intentionally to preserve their tax cuts because they are of the wealthiest elite Americans in this country. There is definitely a class of those Trump voters, but I'm talking about the people you're talking about, right? The ones who've been deceived, the ones who think that they have voted for a better pathway for themselves and their families, but they have not. These are folks, unfortunately, who are going to be impacted directly. And I do believe this is not a defense of it at all, quite the opposite. But that is going to be part of the reckoning, is that until folks feel these impacts directly, they do not believe them. And I think the other thing that is true is that people don't care that Donald Trump is a liar, even though they know that to be true. I think there's a very small evangelized base of his supporters that truly believe him and take him at his word. But for everybody else who voted for him, or let's talk about the 60 million Americans who did not vote in this election, they believe all politicians are liars. So for them, I think it's a much more compelling argument for someone saying, you have been screwed over and I'm going to burn it all down. And they're not even providing a vision of what that looks like, right? To dismantle the government as we know it now. But it doesn't sound like such a bad idea to people who don't feel, truly have not experienced that the government has ever worked for them or helped them.
And that is a problem, though, isn't it? The fact that arguably the system does need an overhaul. And, the biggest issues we come up against are that the founders, their work was so long ago that it bears no resemblance to a modern society, or a modern economy, or modern weapons, or modern rights. And so there is a kind of sense in everybody that, with the greatest of respect to the founders, America is due some kind of a change. They just basically chose the wrong team to do that.
And I think in some ways, and we can't forget the tens of millions of Americans, right, who voted for the Harris-Walz ticket, and who also voted to protect abortion rights in states, and voted to elect a lot of Democrats up and down the ballot in a lot of states, but didn't vote for Harris-Walz, right? That they, this was also a referendum on the Biden administration, of which, I think Kamala Harris run a flawless campaign with the 100 or so days she had to run one. And yet her Achilles heel is that she's the vice president of the Biden administration, and she could not and did not choose to distance herself enough. And we saw, in nearly every Western country in elections since the pandemic, a change in government because economies have suffered. So despite the fact that the Biden administration, the Biden-Harris administration, created the best soft landing for an economy in the world after an unprecedented pandemic, inflation was still something that people felt, right? They felt better financially during the Trump years because of Obama and because of the policies put in place in the Obama administration. But memory is short, nuance is lost, context is lost among most people who do not engage with politics or political information in their lives for good or bad reasons, right? Or neutral reasons. They're just living their lives. And so we have seen this throughout history, right? That Democrats come into office to clean up the mess that Republicans have wreaked on our economy. And then they get voted out because the changes take a while to take. Republicans take credit for those changes when they do hit people's pockets, and then they screw it up again, and we're back at square one. So that's not actually that different, unfortunately. It is really devastating that we could not overcome that, given the work that the Biden-Harris administration did to solve this economy. But I will say that, the messaging over the soft landing, over immense job creation and growth, over the GDP, right? These things do not relate to people in their daily lives. They don't answer the question of, what are you doing for me? They're very, very highbrow, right? They're economic policies. Whereas Trump and his campaign said, we're not going to tax overtime hours. We're not going to tax tips. And you know what people think when they say that? I know how many overtime hours I work every week. I know exactly how many dollars that puts in my pocket. Well, yes. where it's like you say, we're going to go after corporations that are price gouging, and that's why your milk and your eggs are so expensive. There's too many dots to connect there. Oh, okay, that feels like a talking point of a politician. How many dollars does that give back to me? And I think that, again, is, a messaging issue and challenge. And I don't think that's the reason that this election was lost. I think this has been something that has been brewing in this country for a very, very, very long time, that immense resources and activism and organizing was able to delay, essentially. I mean, not for the 4 years we had Trump in office, but we were able to get him out, and then we've lost the thread again. And I think now is a time where we can't ignore that Trump was not an aberration, and that what Republicans have been able to offer through their lying teeth to the American people is more appealing than what feels like a status quo argument or case for the Democratic Party.
It seems that all of the stuff that we thought was losing him votes, like the abuse, the language, wanting to, calling Nancy Pelosi the B word, filleting the microphone, doing his weird dance, all of that stuff that we were like, there's no way anyone is voting for this clown, turned out to be the things that people liked about him. And that's the saddest part of the story for me, is that kind of connective tissue that politicians all strive for. I've kind of analyzed it as maybe the Harris campaign was too holistic and Trump's was much more specific.
So I struggle with this too. I don't actually believe that a lot of people like him for that. I think that they dismiss it. I think a lot of people don't actually like it, but that's not what's important to them, and that's not what triggers their emotional vote, right? Because we do need to remember that our votes, like most of our actions as human beings, are rooted in our emotions and our emotional responses. And I do not believe that there are very many people in this country that voted for him because they like him or agree with his character, if you can call it that. I actually think that it was much more a rejection of our politics and our system as it is. And he does very boldly and consistently represent a rejection of politics as we know it in this country. And he is somebody who says, just trust me. And people don't want to think about politics, or they just want their lives to be better. And they were deceived. And it will take them having these impacts hit them and their wallets, and to see that things don't change, but in fact, they get worse. They don't change for the better, but they get worse, for that to turn around. But it could be too late. It could be too late at that stage, because I do take him at his word when he says that he will be a dictator on day one, and that he will prosecute quote unquote enemies within, his political detractors, journalists who don't do his bidding. Like, we are entering a regime of which countries around the world, millions of people around this world, live within these states where they don't actually have a voice or any rights or an independent press to be able to inform them of what's happening. I don't know how quickly they will be able to institute it, but they have said it. They have laid out the plans, and none of us can think for 1 second that that was hyperbolic. We can hope that some of it was. We can hope that there are systems and firewalls and bulwarks in place to prevent against some of the worst of this, and we will all fight. But we do need to take him at his word around that. And I think that is going to be a very difficult challenge to communicate that and get people to trust it when it comes to bear in this country, given all the challenges you and I talk about all the time about the information ecosystem and how the right wing has dominated it in this country, to the point where half of this country lives in an alternate reality that is based on fiction, not fact. And that is a problem we have got to solve much more urgently than we have seen the investment or the will among the people who don't want to live under an authoritarian country.
There's a new word that's been introduced into the discourse in the last few days, and that is the heterodoxy. This idea of hyper-masculine influencers. I mean, we've seen it with Joe Rogan, we've seen it with Elon Musk, and with Trump himself. I mean, even Mark Zuckerberg, was quoted as saying that he thought it was badass when Trump pumped the air and had the blood coming from his ear. This is one of the explanations for the exodus of Democratic votes, is that these men felt like maybe there wasn't a place for them in the Democratic Party by nature of a female leader, but also so much talk about protecting women's rights, about protecting trans people's rights, and maybe it is said that the Democrats might have dropped the ball with young men.
There's no question of it, right? I think, those of us who are students and participants in the movements for equal rights, equality, and women's rights and equality and bodily autonomy in this country and around the world, we all feared a backlash to Me Too and to the expansion of our rights and our freedoms over many years. And I think that this election has proven that backlash to be real and to be stark. We've had these conversations before, Anthony. That I came into politics and government over the issue of reproductive rights and freedom when I was a young woman. And I mean, it is so unnerving to see the gender divide as we've seen it. And yet we do need to be very clear-eyed that men, and I think it's probably around the world, but certainly in America, they are struggling and not knowing where they sit, what role they play, when their nature and the nature of traditional gender roles is that they are the protectors and the providers. And in a country where women are increasingly going to college at higher rates, graduating from college at higher rates, are the breadwinners now at higher rates in this country, for them to feel like their role has been taken away or replaced, but not knowing what role they then play, of course, there is immense feeling of loss and grief and anger and confusion. And Republicans so smartly and so quickly understood to fill that vacuum and to give them, as they often do for any class of people they want to manipulate and bring to their side, gave them an enemy, gave them a villain to point to, right? Gave them a space to say, your feelings are valid. And we're not gonna do that. We're gonna go back to a place where you had power, where you felt powerful at any cost. And that is appealing. And it's not appealing to all men, right? There are so many good and feminist men in this world and in this country. And yet they also don't necessarily know what space to have, right? All men, I think, felt shamed by the Me Too movement, whether or not they played any role in perpetrating those kinds of abuses against women, especially young men who were raised, right, in like young men who came of age during a Me Too movement that, I will say it, there are a lot of people on the left that use shame and blame in a way that alienates people and especially alienates men. And that's not going to do us any service to get to the country and to the relationship of equality that we actually want to see. And so I think that there is an immense amount of work to do. And I think that men have to be the ones to step up and do it. I don't think that it's going to come from women. And I think that is a really, really, really large task. And we need to see leaders in the progressive movement in the Democratic Party, male leaders, step up to the plate and take that on, because the vacuum that has been left by Democrats not addressing this growing issue and challenge and bleeding out of men of all races away from the Democratic Party, they really need to dig deep and listen and learn and support the healing of that, because that vacuum has been filled by very machismo, toxic men that are giving them a home and a purpose and a space to feel validated with these feelings.
And those men all seem to have a podcast. And we're hearing that this is now going to be the age of the podcast, because the mainstream media has very much failed in its role to hold Donald Trump accountable. I mean, I don't remember hearing anybody say, but your tariffs are actually going to cost consumers more. Very basic language that he was never really held to account over. And so these young people who do have these podcasts and these self-proclaimed white supremacists, the Nick Fuentes, for example, Trump connected with them in a way that Harris didn't. She opted not to engage with these, because this is the way people are getting their media these days, like it or not. And it seems that there was a lot of the disinformation was spread on a platform that was kind of maybe unnoticeable to the Washington elite, because they don't engage with these types of shows, but they do garner huge audiences, not least the Joe Rogan show, which is arguably the largest podcast in the country, and Trump spoke for 3 hours on that show. Now, most of it was garbage, but people seem to be impressed by his stamina and commitment, including Rogan, who then fully endorsed him and had Elon Musk on a day later begging people to vote for Trump.
I will tell you, it didn't go ignored in the Democratic Party, but I will say that I heard many insiders and strategists say that, well, at least young men are the least likely to vote in this country. So let's just all hope that all this focus the Trump campaign is placing on reaching young men, the only demographic he has any ability to gain new voters within, really, although that wasn't true in the exit polls we've seen. We'll talk about that, I'm sure, but that hopefully that they just don't turn out. So there were conversations, there was acknowledgement of how aggressive the Trump campaign and Trump himself was being to reach new audiences of younger men in particular through these podcasts, through these content creators and influencers. And yet it just wasn't taken as seriously as it should have been. And also there just wasn't a strategy. There was no strategy put together to deploy to reach this audience. This audience was not an audience that folks cared about. And, I'm less concerned. I will admit very honestly, I was making, half jokes, half serious comments for a long time about how, I thought that we should suppress young men in general from communications in hopes, because I didn't think that we had any runway to be able to bring them along into the Democratic movement, given how deep rooted and emotionally driven I think are missing where they are and where they were politically was. And yet I also believed that women would turn out at historic rates because of the attacks on our reproductive rights and freedom in a way that would be decisive. That is where I got it wrong. And that is
they did turn out. They just voted for Trump.
Well, correct. Millions of white women in America turned out and voted against their own values for Trump. And that is one of the hardest pills to swallow from the outcome of this election, certainly. And that's another area where we have to do a lot of deep reflection and understanding in order to figure out how the movement and the party got this so wrong. Because I will say that we were not wrong to believe this was possible. You looked at the turnout in places, red states like Kansas and Ohio, where women turned out in record numbers to vote to protect their right to abortion in those states, but it was not connected to a candidate or a party. This is a Democratic Party problem with voters. It wasn't about that. And I think it again gets to the point that millions of Americans don't actually believe, because Trump is so spineless, that he would institute a federal abortion ban in this country. And they don't succinctly connect the dots to the Supreme Court and Dobbs to Trump himself, even though he took full credit for it. And Democrats tried to bring those quotes and those video clips to voters. I don't believe people think that he will actually pursue that. And so while they would turn out and vote for an amendment in their state to protect their right to abortion, they would also very, very, very happily vote for Trump. And I think that's concerning. And that comes down to the information ecosystem.
I also think that the broad immunity that the Supreme Court gave him, the timing of that almost gave him license to claim his innocence. So to the voter, to some voters, they may be like, well, the Supreme Court said that he is immune, which also means that he is right when he says that all of these legal cases were a witch hunt against him and politically motivated. And actually, the most Supreme Court has basically said, no, you're free to go. Did you get that feeling as I did, that immunity ruling actually played quite a large part on the vote, and it had an effect on the vote, because it made some people think that he was innocent?
I don't know if I feel that way. I don't know that many people actually paid attention to that, honestly, which is also depressing. But I trust in the Supreme Court in America is actually at a historic low, especially since Dobbs. I don't think it made enough news. I think that gets to a failure of the media, and the Harris campaign decided not to talk about that or the Supreme Court very often. They made a pivot, for better or for worse, really until the last week again, to really talk about the authoritarian threats of Trump, as much to really talk about her vision, because she was under enormous pressure starting a campaign so epically late to be able to tell people what she stood for and what she believed. That was what they saw as the gap and their Achilles heel that they needed to focus their energy on. And so we took the pedal off of reminding people of what was at stake and the threats. That I think that driving narrative is what supported Democrats winning in 2020 and 2022. And it was mixed because of the nature of starting a campaign out of nowhere unexpectedly just a few months before the election.
I was in the camp that said, of course they're not going to put a convicted felon back in the White House. Of course they're not. And it turned out that being a convicted felon was one of the reasons why people voted for him. It's as if these legal cases became badges of honor, and that it almost gives license to people, well, if he can do it, then I can do it too. And that, some kind of criminal record is not a barrier to being the president. And as toxic as that is, and weird and upside down, I'm kind of coming to terms with the fact that everything that I thought was in this direction was actually in this direction. And that I've been misdirected, and I've kind of lost sight of what morals and decency and values really mean in this country. Do you think that it really comes down to that? Or was it just a big disinformation campaign that meant that people voted for him and just took their chances?
This is the thing, Anthony, is I don't think it's any one thing. I think it's all of them. I think the misinformation was brutal. We know from polling and things of this nature that more people that cast a ballot for him were not willing to agree with true statements about policies or plans. They were getting entirely different information. I do believe that it worked in his favor among some of his voters and supporters that he was a felon. And I think that comes down to what we've been talking about, which is a lack of trust and faith in the system that has failed so many other people. And so it's a very believable narrative that it was a political witch hunt, because people already inherently believe in the corruption and lies of politics and politicians. And so he used that to his advantage. There is a terrifying, evil brilliance into how he played all of this out, right? How he embraced fully, like he raised millions of dollars on his convictions and his mugshot, right? Like this all played into the image he projected of being the one who was going to take down the system that failed you. And I think that, the movement we saw of people away from him during the January 6th hearings, and why the Harris campaign embraced so fully Liz Cheney as a surrogate, and Republicans for Harris and things of that nature, who are really powerful messengers, it just it couldn't compete with the optical visual narrative that Trump put forward about how he was finally going to be the one that destroyed the system that had failed so many people. And once again, these people are going to be failed by him and hurt financially and physically and otherwise by him and in his administration. And that is sadly what it seems like is going to take for them to know that he lied to them. It is heartbreaking. It is disheartening. And I am just not someone to ever wallow in the dark side of this stuff, because I am constantly someone, as I know you are, that is focused on, okay, what do we do now? How do we learn from this? How do we rebuild? How do we listen more? How do we get outside of our own echo chambers more and really understand where people are? Because the Republicans have always understood better than Democrats how to connect emotionally with where people are. They're also shameless and willing to lie once they understand how to leverage and weaponize folks' emotions and concerns and fears, which we are unwilling to do. But we have to approach this result with enormous humility and be able to understand that we have not been telling a story that resonates with the American people about what Democrats stand for and what Trump and his allies actually intend to do that connected with people emotionally.
We have to take a quick break, but I want to come back and talk about how the assassination attempt may have helped Donald Trump too, as many people are saying. We'll do that next on The Weekend Show. Sick of the one-size-fits-all method, especially when it comes to your erectile dysfunction treatment? Well, good news. Now you've got options with Hims. Hims is changing men's healthcare by providing access to affordable sexual health treatments from the comfort of your couch. Hims provides access to doctor-trusted ED treatment options such as chewable hard mints, brand-name treatments like Viagra, or generic alternatives for up to 95% off. The process is simple and 100% online, no uncomfortable doctor's visits. Just answer a series of simple questions on their site, and a medical provider will determine the right treatment option. If prescribed, your medication ships directly to you for free. No insurance is needed. If ED is getting you down, it's time to join the hundreds of thousands of trusted Hims subscribers and get treated. Start your free online visit today at hims.com/weekend. That's HIMS.com/weekend for your personalized ED treatment options. hims.com/weekend. Hard mints are chewable compounded products which are not approved by or verified for safety or effectiveness by the FDA. Prescriptions require an online consultation with a healthcare provider who will determine if appropriate. Restrictions apply. See website for details and important safety information. Subscription required. Prices vary based on product and subscription plan. Breaking news, Cook Unity is the #1 meal delivery service in the USA, and it's easy to understand why. Cook Unity is the first ever marketplace where everyday folks like us discover and celebrate the absolute best food the world has to offer. With award-winning chefs, local farms, and fresh ingredients and vibrant flavors delivered directly to your door. Go to cookunity.com/weekend or enter code WEEKEND before checkout for 50% off your first week. Made with humanely raised meat and organic ingredients where possible, plus fresh, seasonal products. Easy and effortless, choose from hundreds of meals prepared by award-winning chefs, or let them choose for you and enjoy restaurant-quality meals for a fraction of the price. Subscriptions start at as low as $11 a meal. With menus updated weekly and new chefs always joining the team, so you always find new favorites. Eating well is easy with Cook Unity, affordable food crafted by award-winning chefs delivered to your door. Go to cookunity.com/weekend or enter code WEEKEND before checkout for 50% off your first week. That's 50% off your first week using code WEEKEND or going to cookunity.com/weekend. We're back with Tara McGowan here on The Weekend Show. I'm Anthony Davis. The image of Trump fist pumping the air with the blood on his face ricocheted around the world because he, as a propagandist, made it so. And for me, the greatest confidence trick that Trump pulled on people was to refer to the shooter as they. They tried to kill me. And when there was almost a second attempt, that just enabled him to double down on this. They are trying to get me. And the irony of it is that the first shooter was very much a Republican. And, you know, this is the greatest confidence trick of all, is that by playing the victim and by claiming that the shooter was the Democrats and the other side when it wasn't, that he was able to galvanize support because of his victimhood. And, you know, even the wearing of the bandage at the RNC, the unnecessary bandage that then caused others to wear a bandage in solidarity, was a remarkable thing. But it reminded me of, you know, dictators of history who connect over things and rewrite the storyline. They rewrite the narrative in their favor. It's very difficult for Democrats to compete with that, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, we all know an image is worth more than 1,000 words. And that image was, you know, it encapsulated everything about Trump and the projection of strength and strongman masculinity and courage and, you know, victimhood, right? It's me against them. It's us against them being whatever, deep state, Democrats, government, institutions, you know, people out to get you and me. I think that is, you know, I saw more than a dozen over the past year, just strangers in bars and restaurants and coffee shops. Wallpaper was that image on their phone.
Yeah.
Which I appreciated because I knew not to feel safe around a lot of those people. But yeah, it was an iconic image. You know, I'm not going to get into the questions of how that all came to be, but it absolutely worked in their favor.
And the other thing that really surprised me in this election was hearing about bomb threats at polling places that originated in Russia. I mean, I didn't see that coming, and I'm sure you didn't either. But that, coupled with Trump posting on social media that there was violence going on at various places and to stay away, there was clearly a plan to suppress the vote. And a lot of the interference that we're now hearing about, it all stems from the Kremlin. Putin, of course, the first to congratulate Donald Trump on his election victory, and also was quoted the other day as saying that he was so impressed with him when he got up after being shot at. This is the new leadership style for America, isn't it? That the oligarchs are going to be taking over. And I include Elon Musk, who is looking for a place in the administration and was even on the call with Trump and Zelensky on Thursday. I mean, that is, from the off, should be concerning for everybody. And yet that's the new reality.
It absolutely is. And I, you know, have a few theories, but one of them that I have is that I think Trump was as surprised as all of us that he won fairly in this election. The thing that most Democrats and folks and allies in the pro-democracy movement here were planning for, worried about, and planning for was election interference, both by foreign governments like Russia. Russia was responsible for those bomb threats. Those things were anticipated. You know, creating chaos and confusion. And those bomb threats did shut down polling places in Georgia that did lose time and votes, right? And even though the hours were extended, of course, that has an impact. It didn't have an impact on this election, but that is what was expected. That was what I had the most fear and anxiety over, wasn't that he would win fairly. It was that they would find a way to create chaos and confusion, or just have even just one state where the margins were so close for a recount that it could get to the Supreme Court. That is what most of the planning and preparation on the pro-democracy movement side and just the rule of law side of this country was prepared for and preparing for. And I think the thing that no one was really prepared for was that he would win so decisively and fairly in this election. And so, of course, those activities were happening, right, as insurance policies. I think that was more what they were banking on, frankly. And so, and yet now here we are. Elon Musk and Peter Thiel are going to have more control over our government and our economy than any elected official, including Donald Trump, because he is going to give them that permission. RFK Jr., Trump has said explicitly he's going to let him go wild over our healthcare systems and our regulations that keep people safe and healthy in this country. I mean, this is going to be, if they do everything that they have said that they will do, this is going to be the darkest period in our country's history since slavery. There's no question about it. And it is going to take immense work and resources to be able to, as I mentioned before, protect vulnerable communities, protect all Americans from some of this work, and try to fight back and ensure that there are democratic elections again in this country.
Well, that's what I was going to say, because there is the fear that Trump will not leave. And last week he was quoted as saying that he regretted leaving the White House in 2021, and that he should have stayed. And that was, he said that before the vote, and still people voted for him. So this begs the question, and we've seen it with a lot of interviews at Trump rallies with his supporters, that people have decided that dictatorship is a healthier option for them, no matter what it brings. And that is what scares me the most, is that this was a knowing slow walk into authoritarianism. It wasn't, I don't think this is going to take anybody by surprise. I mean, the coverage was there. Kamala Harris was using the word fascist in the last week of the campaign, and still they voted for him.
Because I don't think that they believe it. And you know what? I think he's going to do some of the things he said that we believe he may have lied about to get votes and support, in order to point and say, look how hysterical Democrats were, right? I am going to bring people to you. We know we're going to hear him talk about bringing people together and unifying this country. We know that he is going to play this role, right? Like everything he was saying, which I still believe to be true, that he is going to be a dictator. He is going to do really, really, really horrific things to dismantle our institutions and our government. I do believe he's going to do those things, but he's not going to do them right away, right? He's too smart for that. I think that what he will likely do is try to demonstrate that he is going to be a president that is going to uphold our Constitution and try to bring people together. And then it's going to happen slowly, quietly, and insidiously. And that is going to make it very difficult, right? I do not think that we are going to see a resistance movement of the caliber that we saw when he was elected in 2016. People are exhausted. They are tired. Of course, we're going to see protests in this country, but we also know that they operate on fear. And they have figured a lot of things out since his first term. And they have plans in place. And I think that fear is going to be the currency that they use in this country to be able to keep order and control. And so I think it's difficult, because we needed to be screaming from the rooftops and amplifying him in his own words, saying these things all the time. But the fact that so many people never believe them to be true, if they don't see them happen quickly, that is going to have a further and deeper backlash on the Democratic Party. Which I hate to say that out loud on a show, Anthony, because like if they're not that smart, but you know, that is what I expect. And so it's about being really, really, really vigilant and identifying the opportunities to be able to prevent the worst from happening and inform the public when things do happen or when they are coming, in order to make sure that folks are aware and engaged. I just don't think it's going to look like the way it looked like when he entered office after 2016 and immediately came out with a Muslim ban, right? And incited protests. And if and when they are ready to incite protests, it will be to be able to bring violence on those protesters to quiet protests in this country. So I expect those things to happen. I just don't know the timeline on which we will see them.
I'm sure that banning protests will be up there. And then this is the authoritarian playbook that will inevitably play out. My fear is that because he's tired and older and exhausted, and he kept telling us that he just wanted to be playing golf and be on the beach and he didn't need this, is that he will delegate at quite a significant level to people who have much more skin in the game. The Kevin Roberts, the types of people, Steve Bannon even, the people who have a vision for America that doesn't look like the current one. And I think it's important that we describe it as regime change, because that's really what America will go through if he sticks to this plan, whether it be the Project 2025 plan or the America First plan. Ultimately, these things are all one of the same. And so do you think it's important that we educate people about what regime change looks like rather than just leadership change in government?
Well, absolutely. And I wouldn't call it regime change because we weren't under a regime before. We were under a democratic government. I do think that the Trump regime is the appropriate word. And I think, really terrifying, dangerous folks like Stephen Miller are going to have an enormous amount of power. We can't forget, although I do all the time, that J.D. Vance is now going to be vice president of this country. Anyone who's ever watched J.D. Vance and Trump together in the very, very few hard to find times where they have been can tell that they do not like each other. Trump does not like or respect J.D. Vance. And the reason that J.D. Vance got on the ticket was a deal that was clearly cut with Peter Thiel and Elon Musk in order for them to fund the campaign and be able to be given the unfettered power and authority they're going to have over massive parts of our government and government contracts that they will very corruptly benefit from. J.D. Vance is young. We know that he's a skilled liar. We know from the debate, right? He can put on a great show and make people feel like he is trustworthy. And then when he is on those podcasts we were talking about earlier, he will say the true things that he feels about how women are less than, about how people without children shouldn't have the same rights to vote. He is very dangerous. He is in the pocket of Leonard Leo, who is the mastermind behind the rigging of the Supreme Court and other courts in this country, who is of the Federalist Society, who very much is a true believer in taking away women's bodily autonomy and rights and putting them back into the household. He's a Christian nationalist. He wants a Christian and religious state and government in this country and has billions of dollars to put towards that effort and has been instrumental in Trump's rise and the rise of the MAGA movement across the board in this country. And so it does not start or end with Trump. And so I agree with you. I do not think Trump will be an acting commander in chief for very long, if at all. I think that it is the team that has come in that has absolutely no morals, no values, no empathy for people who are not like themselves. And that's what scares me most, because I knew that J.D. Vance wasn't going to go anywhere if we were able to get the Harris Walz ticket over the line in this election. And that, he is young and he is charismatic.
He's the successor, isn't he?
Deeply dangerous, and he is the successor.
Yeah. And I refer to him as a shapeshifter, because he's changed his identity so much in the last decade. And if you look at the videos of him criticizing Donald Trump, I mean, the guy is almost unrecognizable. And he converted to Catholicism in 2019, from being an atheist, apparently. So, that is quite the religious switch. He does not believe in the separation of church and state. And I think that is very much a theme of a lot of these people, is to blur that line, and so much so as to really bring down the Department of Education and start to indoctrinate children in this kind of far-right Christian nationalist movement from a very early age, which is, typical in these extreme church communities. But I feel like that's something they want for the nation as a whole.
Absolutely. It's already happening in so many red states, right? Prager University, which is an entirely MAGA propaganda machine that is also a tax deductible nonprofit organization, is now creating curriculum for universities and high schools across the country. The book bans that we've seen upheld in states like Texas, in Florida, right? Like there are so many millions of Americans that have already been living in Project 2025's America, that is now going to be expanded really quickly and without much accountability or conflict, because, we Democrats lost everything. They lost the Senate. They're very likely to lose the House. There will be no checks and balances on this government.
And that really is the most important point to communicate, is that the guardrails that we often refer to, as in the separation of powers, the multiple branches of government, none of that will count from January onwards, including the Supreme Court, who of course have laid their cards on the table too. And there's a good chance that he'll replace 2 Supreme Court judges with younger, far-right Christian nationalist white supremacists to double down on these opinions for the next 40, 50 years.
That's right. And the most important people and safeguards to our rights and freedoms we have currently are Democratic governors, because the Supreme Court has moved a lot of our rights and freedoms and the decision over those rights and freedoms to the states. And it is the one bright spot I can find right now in how our government is structured and operates, is that we have a lot of very strong Democratic governors, a lot of which came into office after Trump was elected in 2016, right? Or in 2020, that can protect the rights and freedoms of their citizens. This is where it turns into a very Civil War-like landscape, right?
Yeah. State warfare.
Yeah, and that's how it's been, but it's going to become even much more pronounced now. Because those governors are going to be the frontline defense we have, since we do not have Congress or the Senate. A lot of work is going to start immediately, urgently, to try to ensure a win in the House. A very scary thing for me is that we do not see a path, because of demographics and the electoral map, to get the Senate back for quite some time. But having the House back can help a great deal in terms of accountability. And we're just going to have to see leaders really, really, really step up in a way that we have not seen. And I think that we're going to see new leaders emerge in this moment. And we're going to see a lot of cowards, frankly, in the Democratic Party and progressive movement hopefully fade to the backdrop, because this is going to be scary. People are going to have to take greater risks to speak out and to lead. And so it's going to be a really true test of character and leadership that folks are facing right now.
Why didn't Biden say any of that stuff in his speech a few days ago, where he just talked about congratulating Trump and the peaceful transfer of power? Would you not have wanted the president to offer some kind of public service announcement in that moment and just say, look, we know that your rights are at stake and we're going to do everything we can between now and January to fix that? Something? Because I was disappointed. I wanted more from our president in that moment.
Yeah, I might be defending him too much because I don't know the reason, but my suspicion is that he wanted Kamala Harris to be the voice of that. And I thought her concession speech was quite strong and quite explicit that she was not going anywhere, and that this fight just needs to get more aggressive over the coming months and years to protect our rights. She said all of those things, I think, quite well and quite forcefully in her concession speech. And I think he saw his role and has seen his role more related to legacy of upholding the Constitution and the role, as he has always seen it, of the presidency, and the responsibility of being able to turn the temperature down, which has been true to his brand and his career, his entire life, his political career. Is this deep, deep belief, naive or not, in the year 2024, that we all share more in common than what divides us. And I think he was true to that. And I also think probably he just didn't feel that was the moment for it. I don't think that'll be the last we hear, certainly of Joe Biden, but I do think that he has taken truly to heart and in action the task of stepping aside and letting a new generation of leadership lead. And I personally, I know I'm not alone, I fell in love with Kamala Harris this campaign. My God, did she rise to the occasion, and would I follow her into the fire? Like, I think that her political career is not over by any means. And she already has proven her bravery and her courage and her skills and incredible ability, I think, to communicate. And we saw it, right? At the end of this election, we saw her rise in the polls. The issue with that is that so many people don't understand is that she did not have the runway to turn that into votes. She was starting to build she had enthusiasm like 2008 felt on the ground in certain areas, but she did not have the runway of time. I do believe we could have won that election if there had been more time, or frankly, if there had not been a change in the candidacy in certain ways. It mixed up the pot in a way that gave him advantage in a way that was hard to see. Very hard to see.
We shouldn't forget that she got 68 million votes.
Yes.
And that, that is a feat in itself, especially with just a 100-day campaign. But
yes, and can I say one thing on that, Anthony? Because
sure.
I want to absolutely call out and say how inaccurate and dangerous and just flat out wrong any theories that this country is not ready for a woman president are.
Right.
That is absolutely not true. I don't think it had anything to do with it. I'm sure there are some voters you could find in rural areas or states, right, that didn't want to vote for her because they don't really know why, can't put their finger on it, but it has to do with misogyny or sexism. But that is not the case. Our country is more than ready for that. It was not actually an issue or conversation topic about her being a woman or this country being ready for it. And those are really dangerous narratives the other side would like to see, to have less women believe in themselves. So I do believe vehemently that we will have a woman president in my lifetime, and hopefully very soon.
Hillary Clinton won the popular vote in 2016. So, the groundwork for that has been laid. Barack Obama won the presidency in 2008 as a person of color. So to me, those two things really don't matter going forward. But I think it was an imperfect storm that kind of created this unfortunate movement that in this moment in time, because we haven't mentioned the pandemic, and maybe it's a good time to do so, that Donald Trump successfully erased the pandemic from his history. All this talk of, the cost of living was much better under Trump, ignored 3 years of mask wearing and lockdowns and isolation and COVID testing and vaccines. I mean, it's remarkable, isn't it, that the American people were so keen to forget about the effects of a worldwide pandemic, worldwide inflation, worldwide supply chain issues. Amnesia, it just disappeared from the equation.
That's right. We heard about Trump amnesia all the time, but actually it really was COVID amnesia because people did feel not safe and did not trust him to lead the country at that moment. That did play a massive role in the reasons that he lost, among other reasons. But I do think, I'm not a psychologist, but I think collective trauma, right, leads to that collective amnesia, and he benefited from that quite a bit.
It's so interesting, isn't it? Because it was the biggest thing to happen to all of us in our lifetimes. And, I had young kids at the time who were having to do remote school, and they, eventually when they did go to school, they were meeting their classmates for the first time that they'd been Zooming with. I mean, it was so weird. And yet that has been conveniently forgotten in favor of Donald Trump, as you said earlier, who inherited Obama's strong economy in 2016 and managed to rewrite the history timeline for people. And they bought into that. I mean, it's not just selling a lie, but it's also using hope to make people fill in the gaps of what really went on.
And maybe that was a mistake of the Democratic Party apparatus to actually not remind people as much about that period of time in our collective experience and trauma and how scary it was to have him at the helm, which we know made a difference, and instead chose to remind folks mostly of the insurrection, which also played a bit into his strength, I think, unfortunately.
Talking of the insurrection, we should not leave out the fact that Jack Smith, the special prosecutor, has effectively shutting down his investigations, and this is happening, in fact, with all the legal cases that Trump was facing, where he was finally being held to account. There's a lot of criticism of the Attorney General Merrick Garland, where people are saying, why didn't he prosecute Trump the day after January 6th? When it was so clear that he'd incited this riot, the fake electors scheme, and everything that went with that. I mean, it is such a blatant abuse of his role that he swore an oath to, and yet it seems that there is no legislation in place to prevent him from running for election again, and he did, and he won.
For whatever well-intentioned or strategic reasons that decision was made by Merrick Garland, and I do believe it was made by him, it only reinforced a belief that I think a lot of Americans share, that Democrats are impotent or weak. And that binary between strong man and buck the system, rid of the system, and we're going to play by every rule and in fact be overly cautious to not stir the pot because emotions and temperatures are high and we are not going to be the party that further divides, just played into this feeling that they were not up to the fight to be able to build a government that actually, takes chances and risks and makes real systemic changes to how things operate to help people.
Do you think Biden regrets not replacing Garland? Because, Garland is a conservative, ultimately, and, with a small c maybe, but he plays his cards quite close to his chest. He's a traditionalist. He missed out on a Supreme Court appointment. I mean, there's a lot of history there, isn't there?
There is a lot of history there, but once again, I think that Biden and his administration decided to really focus on the very, very, very urgent crises in front of our country. And they did a phenomenal job doing it, but they didn't communicate it in a way that resonated people. And they did not understand necessarily how deeply affected the American people have been by a system that hasn't supported them. And just the cherry on top that was very visceral for so many people was how costs have become too high. And housing is no longer affordable, right? And that this party and this president, who no one could question is the best president when it came to supporting labor unions and workers' rights in that respect, did not tell a story, right? I think they were once again focused too much on policy solutions and bipartisan policy that they could pass, which they did. They got no credit for that. They didn't get any credit for that. I think that what the American people want is really bold, fearless leadership. People are willing to say things as they are, not massage them into wonky talking points or unemotional things. I think that the Democratic Party lost the thread in terms of common sense communications and how to talk to people and how to make more conversations more inclusive rather than exclusive around certain issues and constituencies and rights. And I mean, I will get a lot of flack for that, but I just think that we need not only a new generation of leadership, but we need leaders who are willing to really call out everything that's wrong with their own party in addition to the opposition. And we did not have that in Biden. I think we had it in a much more stronger way with Kamala Harris, but she also was not untethered or unburdened by the administration she was the vice president in. I would have loved to see her run not as the vice president, and maybe we will again. But I really do believe that for all the good that administration did, they did not get very much credit for it, because they did not show themselves as very bold and fearless fighters against what we were up against until it was too late.
It was almost an impossible task, really, to take on the Trump movement that had almost a decade of misinformation and propaganda behind it, to kind of come and deal with that in such a short amount of time. So I completely agree. We have to take another break, but I want to come back and talk about what's next for the Democratic Party, and indeed for people who voted for Kamala Harris. We'll do that next here on The Weekend Show.
There's a lot happening these days. It can feel especially stressful or even hopeless when things are outside of your control. But Calm can help you restore your sense of balance and peace amidst outside chaos. Maybe you've had difficulty focusing, things like parenting pressures or work challenges or school commitments or just a personal drama that can wreak havoc on your ability to stay focused and productive. If you're dealing with a lot of stress, these feelings don't just disappear at bedtime. Trouble falling asleep, waking up in the middle of the night, not feeling rested in the morning, these are all signs that your bedtime routine could use an upgrade. Calm can help you learn to de-stress and fall asleep faster so you can get a restful night every sleep. Calm is the #1 app for sleep and meditation, giving you the power to calm your mind and change your life. Meditations to help you work through anxiety and stress, to boost your focus, build healthier habits, and take better care of your physical well-being. Sleep stories, sleep meditations, calming music that will help you drift off to a restful sleep quickly and naturally. Stress less, sleep more, and live better with Calm. For listeners of our show, Calm is offering an exclusive offer, 40% off a Calm premium subscription at calm.com/weekend. Go to calm.com/weekend for 40% off unlimited access to Calm's entire library. That's calm.com/weekend.
We're back on The Weekend Show with Tara McGowan. Tara, we're all feeling a little numb. And I think that people might not understand what that numbness is. And it's not just about Kamala Harris losing the election, but it's a numbness for the social groups who will suffer under a Donald Trump presidency, many of whom voted for Donald Trump unwittingly. Minority groups, women certainly, LGBTQ plus people, but also immigrants who he claims he will deport en masse. And the logistics of that I don't quite understand. I mean, maybe he'll force the military to come and deal with that. I don't know what that's going to look like. And I'm pretty terrified as to A, where are they going to go? B, what's it going to cost? And C, will families be separated, as is typical with a Donald Trump administration? But what we're left with now is also, through this, finding the strength to pick ourselves back up as pro-democracy people. And I struggle to even get my head around a vision for the future of the Democratic Party, considering that the opposition is so great. What do you think it looks like? Where do we start? And how do we overcome this huge sadness that has come from voters choosing dictatorship over democracy?
Oh, goodness. Lots of thoughts, a lot of ones still processing.
No rush.
I do think that in this moment, still so fresh and so raw from the results, that everybody is processing, and many folks are grieving, and many folks are exhausted because many people put their blood, sweat, and tears for the last year, 2 years, 9 years in some of our cases in this fight against Trump, that there is a really important need for people to be able to rest and reflect. Right? I think anything that is reactionary is not helpful or constructive. There's a lot of finger pointing going on X/Twitter that I don't think is constructive or useful, but I'm sure feels cathartic to a lot of people. There was no one reason that this occurred, that Trump won. I think that there are big, deep, long-seated reasons that we've talked about, right? About misses by the Democratic Party, about income inequality and just trust in politics and politicians and what Trump offers. And then there are a lot of tactical missteps, I believe. And I could talk about those for hours, as I'm sure you know. But I do think that we need new leadership across the board in the Democratic Party. And there are a lot of amazing new leaders that have come into office and come into power in this era post 2016. And they are, we have an incredible bench, honestly, in the party of new and young and diverse talent who are bold and fearless, but they are not in leadership, and they need to be in leadership. And our leadership needs to change. And that's not true in the House, right? Hakeem Jeffries, Nancy Pelosi very bravely passed the baton on to a new generation of leadership there. And yet the Senate has not done that. The first to advocate for that, I think it is time for Chuck Schumer to step down from leadership and give other folks a chance in the US Senate. I think that we are going to, as we have been the past few years, start paying a lot more attention to our younger governors across the country who are wildly popular and inspiring, like Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan and Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, and so many others. And I think that there needs to be a real effort amongst new leaders who are empowered and emboldened to really just clear the decks and start from scratch with listening and understanding where people are, listening and understanding in a more nuanced way what happened, how this happened, right? What often happens, and what is a frustration for me, having worked in politics and Democratic politics for so long, is the failing up culture, right? If a candidate or a campaign wins, everything was brilliant and smart and should be done again and again. And I think I mentioned this earlier, but I think 2020 was an accident, a fortunate accident in some ways. But I do not believe that the Biden campaign ran a strong campaign in 2020. I believe that it was the efforts of mine and so many of my colleagues that were running some of the major super PACs at the time when there was no candidate, and it was a very, very crowded primary in the Democratic primary, that did the work incessantly, nonstop from the moment that he was elected, and some of us before then, through to that election, to be able to diversify our tactics and our resources and our coordination to be able to bring as many people out as possible. And it was still such a razor thin election, right? Had all those efforts not come to bear or been resourced at the levels they were, which, by the way, they were not resourced in 2024 at all. Just for perspective, my organization ran a $75 million program online in 2020. We weren't able to raise half of that and deploy that in 2024. A lot of the playbook that won us so many seats up and down the ballot in 2018, 2020, and 2022 was thrown out for an incumbent traditional playbook this time around. There has to be accountability on that. We have to change leadership at every level. We have to change over the people who hold the purse strings in the progressive movement in the Democratic Party to people who have been fighting, like myself and so many others, to build new infrastructure that is more effective, that is more responsive to the American people that I think feel the most left behind by the Democratic Party and other institutions. And, that is going to take work, and that is not going to happen overnight. But there are so many of us who are already rolling up our sleeves and willing to do that work. And I think that we really need to ask and demand and insist upon the humility of the folks who have done great service to this country in their careers to step aside and to let new folks lead. And I think that, donors will play a role in that, who do have power in a system of government where we do not have campaign finance reform, as we know. But there needs to be a upheaval and a transition in terms of who has power and access to power, to be able to rebuild a vision and build a new vision for this country and a story, frankly, that espouses all of the values that Democrats have always held dear and the work that they do on behalf of the most vulnerable communities, but the story has not resonated. And we need a new story, and that story needs to be told by new leaders. And I think that is what we will see over the coming months.
Because there was no shortage of revenue. I mean, Harris raised over $1 billion, which is unprecedented. But the use of that money, putting it into traditional media, TV ads, I mean, people don't really watch television, let alone the ads. And so there definitely was this very nostalgic view of running a campaign, which, clearly didn't really work for her, because as we know, we discussed earlier, Trump reaching out to this new media. We shouldn't even call it new media anymore. I mean, that's a bit of a dated phrase in itself. But the way that we all communicate and the way that we are all connected does not have a huge amount to do with these traditional methods, even door knocking, which Kamala Harris was doing in Pennsylvania on the final day. Donald Trump didn't do any door knocking. He subcontracted it and it never really happened. And yet he still managed to secure a win.
Yeah, I am worried about the lessons that will be learned or not learned from this election. I do want to say, I do not think organizing is dead. I think that the Biden campaign knew that there was low enthusiasm for him, so they didn't build a field infrastructure like Obama intentionally, because they didn't think they would have the volunteers to support it. And suddenly the candidate changed and there was immense enthusiasm, and they didn't have the infrastructure to expand to bring those volunteers in until the very end, right? I also was knocking doors for the campaign in Philly, North Philly, on election day, and there was palpable enthusiasm on the ground, but they just didn't have the timeline. So I do think we need to be really careful. This was such an unprecedented election, and there were decisions made when Biden was at the top of the ticket that did not serve Kamala Harris at all, but no one could predict that at the time. But to your point about the media, this is really important. And I am seeing this in a lot of the takes, but I see it in the takes all the time when Democrats lose. Why isn't there a progressive media in this country? Why have we let the right wing build this media and define the information landscape? And hello, I try so hard not to get a chip on my shoulder in these conversations, Anthony, as I know you do too, because I've been beating this drum for 10 years. I've built the largest progressive news network in this country that is scalable and growing fast at Courier. We are doing this work. Could we have had an even larger impact? Oh my God, yes, on this election. But we were given pennies to the dollar, if anything at all, by the folks that funded, to the tune of $1 billion, traditional tactics and advertising programs that ran tested ads that were wildly out of touch with where the American people were emotionally, because they tested well in binary tests by data gurus. If I can't even get into all of the things that are wrong with our playbook and the decisions made around investing and embracing new media models. And I hope that this is the final nail in the coffin on this idea that legacy media and advertising is enough to be able to earn trust and drive message to increase voter turnout. That has to die. That belief system has to die. I will make it my mission, as it has been, to ensure that it does, because we have the resources to be able to have a robust, massive, and effective media ecosystem and infrastructure in this country that holds Trump and MAGA accountable and does not ever betray our values and our commitment to truth and our ability to be able to tell the truth and uphold the truth without dividing or sowing confusion or chaos, as the right does, to be able to manipulate the masses. We don't need to do that, but we need the resources to be at scale that we have not received. And I will tell you, we have been building Courier for 5 years. We are not starting from ground zero. We have over 4.5 million subscribers across the 11 battleground states where we have newsrooms. We have nothing but opportunity and ability to scale and grow quickly. We just need resources to do that. And those resources need to come with a commitment by donors and investors who are wildly pro-democratic and share our values, but they need to stop asking what other return they're going to get, because I guarantee you that argument about why did Elon Musk waste so much money, lose so much money on Twitter, I'll tell you exactly why. It had nothing to do with money. Elon Musk is the richest man on the planet. Elon Musk could become a trillionaire, the first ever trillionaire on this planet. Elon Musk did that very strategically to be able to have a propaganda machine. And that is how he used it, and that is how he will use it. Where are our investors and donors and patriots who understand that the only way to win and maintain power in this country is to win and maintain control over the information ecosystem to make sure that truth is the thing that reaches most people's news feeds and phones and television sets? And that we are not there yet. We are not close to there yet. And we need to catch up very, very quickly.
It's interesting how even Trump has managed to convince people that the media is funded and run by the left. And the left are complaining that the media is funded and run by the right. And so there is this kind of miscommunication about who runs the media. And you're right, we might not have really understood why Elon Musk wanted to spend $44 billion on Twitter a few years ago, but now it makes perfect sense. And, he hasn't changed his politics in the last 6 months. He's always been that guy. He just kept it on the lowdown. And so now that he's kind of created this huge level of support, I mean, he is seen like a superstar, showing up at the rallies, jumping up and down, and now being on the phone with Volodymyr Zelensky with Donald Trump. I mean, that just shows what kind of administration we have to look forward to. And we do need to start referring to these people as oligarchs, because that's what they want, ultimately. And, oligarchs, from my history in London, were buying up newspapers decades ago. And, we were wary of that. And it's important we don't consider the phrase oligarch to be kind of exclusive to Russians, even though the Democrats could take a leaf out of Putin's PR playbook and find out how he managed to communicate with so many voters. Because clearly the tactics that they are using are far more effective than the traditional media that the Democrats are playing catch-up with.
These are incredibly dangerous men who are motivated by greed. It is in their self-interest that they care about political power. It is not actually, outside of Leonard Leo, who I mentioned, right, who is backing and has been instrumental in the Supreme Court rigging. But when it comes to Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and Donald Trump himself, they are motivated by greed and self-interest. That is why they wanted political power. We will see more corruption, if we can see it, if we can shed light on it, than we have ever seen in this country, in terms of where government contracts go, in terms of decisions related to the economy, because it will be decided by people who literally benefit financially from every single one of those decisions they now are at the table to make and influence. And this is the greatest error the folks who voted for Donald Trump have made without knowing it, is that they have given power to people who will only take more from them and on their backs to be able to benefit themselves, because they will protect themselves as they do mass deportations and close the border. And as climate change and the impacts of that become far more severe here and around the world, and we have massive refugee crises and massive humanitarian crises, they will be fine, because they will have consolidated so many resources and power on all of our backs. That is what we are up against right now. That is what we have to try our best in all of the ways, using all of the tools and weapons available to us to prevent. That is the task ahead.
We haven't mentioned climate change, really, and nor did Donald Trump, funnily enough. we've now voted in a climate change denier into the White House at a most critical time for world temperatures. And, this last year was the hottest on record. This year is going to be even hotter. There is, so much evidence confirmed that we have almost passed that point of no return. And I even heard a story that the latest COP meeting that's taking place in the Middle East, there was a secret recording that showed that the organizer is doing a deal with fossil fuel companies already. I mean, the corruption surrounding and the lobbying surrounding fossil fuel, that is very much in Donald Trump's back pocket. And he promises to drill, baby, drill. But that, again, it's so very sad in this moment, isn't it? That really climate change now is just going to go on ice, if you'd pardon the expression, for the next 4 or 5 years.
Yes. I think that this election has determined that. We were already too far gone in many respects, and now we know that all of the progress that was made will likely be rolled back. And we don't have time to undo that again. And so this is where it becomes very, very overwhelming, right? And we cannot be paralyzed by it because that is what they want and what they count on. But it is difficult not to be when you start to really understand what we lost on Tuesday, because we did lose this planet. Potentially, we did lose our basic human rights and freedoms if they do everything that they have said to do. And he cut a deal in his campaign with fossil fuel executives and industries to fund his campaign. And he said he would roll back regulations and elevate them. So, I am trying to stay focused on the task ahead in the fight, because when we do focus on what will come to bear, what will come to pass because of the results of this election, it is really, really overwhelming and terrifying, not just for us, but for countries and populations around the world. And we just have to stay clear-eyed and vigilant and count on the fact that there are more good people in this world, and that they will fight back when these things hit their lives, which they inevitably will. And we have to be able to be there to help channel that and organize with it. But this is the scariest moment certainly I've ever experienced in our country. No question.
It's like a wake-up call in a way, isn't it? And, if we can put any positive spin on this, it basically is telling all of us to not take anything for granted and to kind of presume that everybody is good and everybody has good intentions for the planet and for minorities and for women. It simply isn't the case. And when it's difficult to make a living because of the cost of living over the last 50 years continuing to rise and wages not following that people will look for someone to blame. And for me, this all comes down to economics. All of these decisions have come down to the fact that the rich have got richer, the poor have got poorer, and the Democrats did talk constantly about expanding the middle class, maybe to the detriment of the working class.
That is accurate. And I think that I very much believe that we get the democracy we deserve. And I very much believe that for all of the 60 million people who were eligible and chose not to vote in this election, and the millions of people who voted for Trump because they didn't think it mattered anyway, and that maybe this guy will change the system that hasn't worked for them, there is going to be a very, very, very harsh awakening in reality when they experience what their lives are like under a system of government that is an authoritarian regime in a planet that has been just absolutely given away in a bribe to the fossil fuel industries that are actively destroying it. And this is really, really sad, but I do believe it deep in my soul that people have to experience these things to learn or to understand. And so that's what we now are stuck with. We have prevented it, the worst, and now it's here. And, the thing that drives me is that we need to shed light on every single bit of it. and make sure that we bring people along and be really, 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 we need, this is not just a selfish or shameless plug, but we need to change the information ecosystem, because as long as people are believing the lies and the deception and they are under that manipulation and that power, we don't stand a chance. We don't, because they don't need to, as we just learned on Tuesday, they do not need to eradicate democratic elections in this country if they have just deceived the majority of Americans to vote on their false agenda that they've sold them. And so we have to do all of these things at once.
A lot of us, our devastation and feeling of wanting to throw in the towel was short-lived, actually, because I'm sure you with Courier and certainly me with 5 Minute News received an unprecedented amount of correspondence from people saying, please don't stop. Now is the time for independent media. Now is the time for our voices to become essential, where the corporate media has failed people. People don't really know where to turn. And with your newsrooms and your correspondence and your excellent journalism and Midas Touch and any of these groups that have really kind of galvanized pro-democracy support, we are needed now more than ever.
We are needed now more than ever. And also there are so many more stories that people are aware of, right? Related to the cowardice of Jeff Bezos and the Washington Post's failure to endorse, which really was an endorsement for Donald Trump, right? Their anticipatory obedience, if you will, to keep a seat at the table and to be able to have access to this administration for better or for worse. We need to have alternative media that is brave and bold and unabashed about our accountability work in journalism. And we need to get bigger and we need to get louder and we need to be operating at a scale that has not been funded or imagined, frankly, by folks. And that needs to be funded by everybody. That is a big shift for us, right? We relied on investors and donors in the movement really to build Courier. And I'm so proud of what we've built, but this can't be done by them alone, especially if they are timid. This has to be a project of the American people to be able to help us all grow and to help new models like ours come onto the scene, because I couldn't agree with you more. We have never been more essential and more necessary. And we are the ones who are not going to cow to them when it gets really hard and when the threats are becoming very real, because this goes beyond. We are not here for profit margins. We are here to be able to protect and represent the American people, and to be able to protect and preserve a democracy in this country. And so there is no time at which we will ever back down on that mission.
It's an important message to end on. We have to finish, but for now, Tara McGowan, thank you for joining the Weekend Show.
Thank you, Anthony, and for everything you do.
I'm Anthony Davis. Don't forget to support me and independent journalism at patreon.com/5 Minute News. You can also join the YouTube channel. You can see more of me right there. And I'll come back next Sunday with a brand new special guest and more factual news to discuss on the 5 Minute News Weekend Show with Midas Touch.